So our speaker today is your now Professor James Brown, no less. So James actually is a former Daiwa scholar from 2011. And when we first interviewed him, he'd already got fluent Russian. But as an expert in Japan-Russia relations, he wanted to add Japanese, which he duly did on our program very successfully. And immediately got a job at Temple University in Japan and quickly rose to become head of department and professor. And he's one of the leading experts on Japan-Russia relations, frequently cited in the media, especially media in Japan. And he's published a couple of books about Japan-Russia relations. This one seems to be a slightly lighter style of book about espionage between, well, Russian espionage on Japan, isn't it? And I'll leave it at that, James.
Great. Well, thank you very much. Thank you all very much for coming. When I saw what the weather was like, I was a little bit worried that a few of you might get diverted into the nearest park for an ice cream or perhaps into a local pub garden. But thank you very much for coming this evening. And thank you also enormously to the Daiwa Anglo-Japanese Foundation, not just for hosting this event this evening, but also, as noted, I was a recipient of the Daiwa Scholarship in 2011. It really was a life-changing experience. That's saying it with no exaggeration whatsoever. Did my PhD to do with Russian foreign policy in Scotland. Frankly, didn't know that much about Japan, but thanks to the scholarship, I've been based in Japan now since 2011, and as Jason noted, focused very much on Russia-Japan relations. It was also through Daiwa that I met my wife at the orientation event before going to Japan, and we now have 2 children. So really, I should have honored Daiwa by calling our firstborn Daiwa or Yamato or something. So thank you very much. So on to the book then. And I thought I'd start off by saying a bit about the origins of the book. So it really begins back here. So here's a photo of a younger looking me in 2016 when I did the book launch here for my previous single-authored book, which was about the territorial dispute between Japan and Russia. It was called The Northern Delusion. So after that, I went off and did some other things, did a couple of co-edited books, lots of newspaper articles, shorter projects, but I decided I wanted to really get my teeth into a major project again. So I thought about what could be the next thing for me to focus on. And perhaps it's always the case with book projects, but to begin with, there were few false starts. And I had this idea that I was going to do this very detailed study of Japan's Ministry of Foreign Affairs, going into a lot of detail about the culture of the institution, its history, its different institutional elements. I spent months on this, but eventually I decided that it just wasn't that interesting. Had I gone down that route, I wonder how many of you would be here this evening. So instead, I decided to try and do something a bit more entertaining. And everyone likes a good spy story. So that's how I focused on espionage. I'll speak a little bit today about Richard Sorge. That's the part of the story that often people know. But I think there's a lot more to the history of Russian spying on Japan, and I wanted to tell that story. And the other thing I wanted to do is to write a non-academic book. Academic books can be great, go into a huge amount of detail, they can be exhaustive in what they cover, but often they can be a bit dull, sell very few copies, and also the publishers tend to charge a huge amount for them. So I was looking earlier today at the cost of that previous book, which is now almost 10 years old. The hard copy is still £282. So that's the downside of academic books. So I wanted to do something more mass market. So specifically, my aims with the book were threefold. Firstly, and most obviously, to tell the story of Russian espionage against Japan. and in particular to show that there's more to it than Richard Sorge. The Richard Sorge story is fantastic. It's very entertaining. There are lots of books about it. I can talk more about it later if you wish. There is a chapter about it within the book, but I wanted to show the rest of it, to show there's more to this story than Sorge. The second one was to tell the history of this bilateral relationship through the lens of espionage. There are plenty of books about Japan-Russia relations. Most of them tend to focus on the territorial element. I contributed to that myself with the previous book, but I wanted to tell the story through the espionage lens. So if you read the book, I hope you will come away not only knowing about the spying, but also with a good understanding of the broader relationship. You might well know the famous Clausewitz saying that warfare is the continuation of politics by other means. I take the view that you can say the same thing about espionage, because in looking at the spying, you can see what the government was trying to achieve in its political relationship. And then the last bit is to have a bit of fun, to entertain, at least in part. Now, it is a properly researched book. If you look in the back of it, you'll see endless pages of notes, huge bibliography, but I've tried to keep it relatively light and to include things that, well, at least amused me. So here's one example. On the section to do with the Battle of Nomonhan, that's Halkin-Gol in 1939, members of a Soviet reconnaissance unit donned sheepskin coats in order to infiltrate a flock of sheep and get close to the Japanese lines. So anyway, that tickled me. So there's lots of things like that in there. I've got this picture, rather grainy image here of some Japanese diplomats sitting around a table, one of them circled. I'll get back to him later on. What I'm going to do now is, after briefly mentioning the table of contents, so you can see what is covered, I'm going to just mention 4 specific parts of the book. But here's the table of contents. You can see that I start right back in the 18th century, move forward to when Russia and Japan became rivals in the latter part of the 19th century. You've got the Russo-Japanese War, of course. You've got the rise of the Soviet Union and the first Bolshevik spies, their influence on the Japanese Communist Party. For one, Nomonhan, the Sorge ring that was mentioned earlier, and then Sorge's contemporaries as well. I finish off, somewhat sort of controversially, with a textbook account of how to spy on Japan, setting out what would be the best approaches for having success in that. Now, that's not to say I'm encouraging spying on Japan. Rather, it's to try and learn from how Russia had success in order to perhaps indicate how Japan could better defend itself. Okay, so to start off with the first of these 4 little sections that I'm going to focus upon. And I begin with how the book starts, with the first Russian spy, in inverted commas, in Japan. This is back in 1771. Many of you will know that this was the Sakoku period, Japan's period of national isolation, where foreigners were told to keep away and Japanese were prevented from leaving the country. But in 1771, you have this Russian supply ship suddenly turning up on the coast of rural Shikoku. And the commander of that ship, the locals called him Hambengoro. The initial reports are quite interesting. The locals hadn't really seen Europeans before, and this is one of the reports. The adult male height is 3 meters and a quarter. Their noses are hooked and at least 4 inches long. Their faces were red and their bodies white. So I think we can say it's likely there was a fair degree of exaggeration, although it does sound a bit like a British rugby team on holiday in Ibiza. Anyway, they were in a terrible state. They had been essentially lost at sea, kind of without proper supplies. They were near starvation. They had been eating everything on the ship, including some sort of leather shoes. They were really desperate, and they were saved by the local population. They provided them with food and drink and sent them on their way. So treating them very well, despite that it was the Sakoku period. What happened next was very unusual. Hanbengoro, the commander of this Russian vessel, left a letter with the local daimyo, local lord, saying, having received orders from Russia to reconnoiter Japanese strongholds, I sailed this year with 2 galleots and 1 frigate from Kamchatka to the Japanese shores. Next year, raids will be made on the territories of Matsumai, Hokkaido, and on neighboring islands. Speaking secretly, I hope you will send ships from your country to ward off that harm. So it's a very seemingly strange start to this history of Russian spying. We have this guy who's been ordered, it seems, to reconnoiter Japan in preparation for an attack. And yet, having been saved by being given these supplies, he then decides to reveal what his mission was and actually encourage the Japanese to attack the Russians preemptively. Now, I won't give it away here, but you might have guessed that Hanbengoro wasn't who he seems. It was a Russian ship, the crew was Russian, but he was not honest in what he told the Japanese. You can ask about it later if you like, but I'll leave it as a bit of a cliffhanger for the time being and move on to the second one that I want to emphasize. Here we're moving forward to the end of the 19th century. Japan, after its Meiji restoration, has gone from very much a backwater to a real rival of the Russian Empire, with that rivalry played out primarily in Korea and also in northeast China. And the Japanese are gradually getting the upper hand in Korea. In particular, you had the queen, the Korean queen, Queen Min, who was much more favorable towards Russia. And so, with the orders of a Japanese officer, she was murdered in 1895. And with her out of the way, it gave the Japanese the opportunity to exert a lot of influence over the king. King Gojong was seen as quite a weak figure, and he was essentially made a prisoner of the Japanese within his own palace. They used that influence in order to pressure him to appoint a cabinet favorable to the Japanese, and that helped to turn Korea towards Japan. So what the Russian chargé d'affaires decided to do is, without authorization from the capital, he decided to engage in his own bit of intrigue. And I should say that within the book, it's not just classical spying. It's not just the stealing of secrets that I focus on, but all the other kind of intrigue, influence operations, and general skullduggery. So this is one of these cases. What they do, Speer arranges to smuggle the king out of the palace, dressed in women's clothing, to get him to the safety of the Russian legation, and then he shifted from being under Japanese influence to being under Russian influence. And once he's in the legation, the pro-Japanese cabinet is dismissed. Several of its members are then arrested and executed, and it allows Russia, at least temporarily, to draw Korea back towards its influence. Of course, that comes to an end with Russian defeat in the Russo-Japanese War of 1905. But at least temporarily, a success for the Russians there. On to the third one, before I get to the fourth, which I'll go into in more detail. That is the Tanaka Memorial. So we're moving here towards 1920s, 1930s. Now, this is a document supposedly written by Tanaka Giichi, who is both Prime Minister and also Foreign Minister, supposedly written by him in 1927. And it's a notorious document because it seems to set out Japan's plan for global domination. The most notorious line in it states that to conquer China, Japan must first conquer Manchuria, Mongolia. To conquer the world, Japan must first conquer China. So when, in the 1930s, Japan then pushed forward with its expansionism, it seemed to be fulfilling this master plan set out by Tanaka. Now, it is without any doubt that this is a forgery. This document is absolutely a fake. There is no question that it was not written by Tanaka or indeed any other Japanese official. But the Soviets made very successful use of it. There's some doubt as to who was behind the forgery. It's probably more likely the Chinese rather than the Soviets, but they were very successful in turning it to their advantage. And interestingly, we have a quote from Trotsky, not long before his unfortunate encounter with an ice pick, talking about the Tanaka Memorial and what happened when it came into Soviet hands. He describes that Felix Dzerzhinsky, Iron Felix, the head of the Soviet intelligence services, stated ecstatically that this document in and of itself could provoke international upheavals, events of vast importance, war between Japan and the United States. So the Soviets spot an opportunity here. They want to encourage tensions between Japan and the United States, both rivals, competitors. If they've got bad relations with each other, that's very useful for the Soviets. So even though it's not their own forgery, what they do is they start to promote it, especially in the United States. They translate it, they use Comintern-connected groups in order to publicize it in the United States, and they have great success because it's feeding into existing prejudice towards Japan, existing assumption that Japan has these expansionist ambitions. And so it was picked up by many US publications. They described it as Japan's Mein Kampf, and it helped to feed into anti-Japanese feeling. The remarkable thing is that even though it's so obviously a forgery, the Russians still continue to insist that it's a real document. A few years ago, I did a little project on new Russian textbooks. I had a project to introduce more sort of nationalistic textbooks. One of the authors, Vladimir Medinsky, who's been involved in those Istanbul talks with Ukraine. And within them, I was interested in what they said about Japan. And one of the things they do say is that the Tanaka Memorial was a genuine document and showed Japan's aggressive intentions. So even after almost a century, they're still making use of this forgery in order to try and shape views of Japan, at least within Russia. Okay, so that's the first three, giving you a taste of the earlier parts of the book. What I now want to do is to spend a bit more time talking about one particular individual from the book, to move it up until the war years, and to focus on a person that many of you probably have not heard of before, because he's not received very much attention at all, especially compared with Richard Sorge. So this is Izumi Ko. Pictured there, it's about the only picture of him. So I've kind of inexpertly circled him with red here, the bold gentleman sitting at the table with his Japanese diplomatic colleagues. So he was a Japanese diplomat who was posted to Moscow in 1925. Early in the period when diplomatic relations had been established between Japan and the Soviet Union. And the Soviet intelligence services arranged for him to stay with a lady called Elizaveta Perskaya. Her husband, who had been a Tsarist officer, had been killed by the Bolsheviks. She was in a somewhat sort of desperate situation, and it seems likely that the Soviet intelligence services always intended to use the family in order to try and recruit Izumi Ko. Because what happens is he ends up marrying her daughter, Yelena. Marries her in 1927. They have a son in 1930. Now, perhaps it was always the intention, or perhaps they placed pressure on Yelena later on. But what certainly occurs is they decide they want her to spy on her husband. They pressurize her. She seems to show some resistance initially, and so they lock up her mother. They send her to the Gulag, and both her sister and brother-in-law are executed. But the Soviets don't tell her that. They say they're just being put into a hospital. So unless she cooperates, it's going to be bad for her family. So she gives in. She begins to take documents from her husband, who's a Japanese diplomat, as mentioned, and then she recruits him so that he directly starts to work for the Soviets. And he hands over a huge amount of material. Most importantly, it's code books. The thing he hands over of importance, first of all, 7 code books accompanied by assorted coded telegrams. Really useful material if you're seeking to crack Japan's diplomatic codes. And what's really helpful is he remains in place. That means that when Japan's codes are changed, he can simply provide updated code books. So this is really valuable. As a result of this, the Soviets are able to read much of Japan's diplomatic communications in the years leading up to the war and then during the war. One indication of the particular importance of this information is that Sergei Tolstoy, who was the Japanese specialist for the NKVD in their cipher directorate, he became the most decorated Soviet cryptanalyst of the war, obviously indicating he was having some success. Success, I think, that was assisted by Izumi. I should mention his code name was Nero, which is why I've got the bad joke of the emperor of Soviet spies against Japan. Anyway, it's also likely that Izumi was especially important because it's known that Stalin favored signals intelligence over human intelligence. Clearly, we know that Stalin had a bit of a trust problem, didn't really trust people. Why then would you especially trust spies, people who have a record of deceit? So he didn't. Famously, he ignored so many warnings of Barbarossa in 1941, and even Richard Sorge, who was providing very good quality information from Tokyo, which he was accessing from the German embassy, he had a very low opinion of him. Apologies for the bad language, but you can blame Stalin. He described Sorge as a shit who had set himself up with some small factories and brothels in Japan. So he's very dismissive of Sorge. So the material that they seem to have been able to crack, thanks to Izumi's assistance, gave the Soviets information about German-Japanese discussions of a plot to assassinate Stalin. So when they sought to infiltrate individuals into the Soviet Union, they didn't get very far. They were intercepted and liquidated. He also provided material that helped give warnings of Barbarossa, obviously the Nazi invasion in 1941. Again, Stalin didn't pay sufficient attention to that, but then also reassurances that Japan would not attack the Soviet Union in 1941. So a reminder that the Soviet Union and Japan had signed a neutrality agreement in April of 1941, promising not to go to war with each other. But with the launch of Barbarossa, there was the real worry within the Soviet Union that Japan would join the fight. They would then be facing a war on 2 fronts. So the key piece of information they wanted was, is Japan going to go north to join the fight against the Soviet Union or go south? So access to those diplomatic codes helped to provide reassurance that Japan had decided to go south. Now, there's one further thing about the importance of Izumi's information, which just came to light recently. So this actually isn't in the book because it was published by Russian state media just in May. So they have this article selectively using some documents released from the FSB archive in order to promote their version of the Second World War. So it's Secrets of Cipher Telegrams. This document refers to lots of intercepted telegrams, but particularly prominent are ones sent by Japanese diplomats, listed here. Now, in the article, it doesn't mention how they accessed these, but my assumption is that the code books provided by Izumi were key to them getting this material. And so you can see that it wasn't an isolated case. They seem to have extensive access to Japan's supposedly secret communications. Okay, so he was a very influential figure. And yet, what happened to him? Well, in the case of Richard Sorge, he was arrested by the Japanese and put in Sugamo prison and then executed in 1944. In the case of Izumi, however, he was never caught by Japan. Instead, he finished the war in Europe, slowly made his way back, returning to Japan in March 1946. He was without his wife and son. Difficult to know exactly what happened, but it seems that at one point they went back to the Soviet Union. He lives in sort of poverty for a couple of years, seems to move in with his sister, just trying to get his life back in order. But then in 1948, he approaches the Soviet embassy. I should stress that the reason why Izumi seems to have agreed to cooperate with the Soviets was not for money. It was rather a real devotion to his wife and son. And so in line with that, in 1948, his motivation in approaching the Soviets was to try and get information, what happened to them, and to try and get back in touch with them. The Soviet side, however, says, okay, we'll look into it. In the meantime, perhaps you could be of assistance to us. So what they do is they re-recruit him in the post-war era. By this time, he's no longer a Japanese diplomat, so he's not as useful as he was previously, but still he's got his old contacts, and so he assists the Soviets between 1948 and 1952, around 40 meetings, and is paid around 30,000 yen a month, which was a lot of money at the time. So you might be wondering, how do we know quite so much about Izumi? It's because of a defection. Finding out information about spy cases is always difficult. You can't access most archives in the way you can with other subjects. So it's really helpful when you have a defection. There have been several really important ones in the case of Russia and Japan. One of the biggest was in 1954. Yuri Rastvorov defects from the embassy in Tokyo, goes over to the US side, is taken out of Japan, and he gives the US, and then subsequently everyone else, everything he knows, identifying 36 agents operating for the Soviet Union within Japan, and one of them is Izumi Ko. So the police, after these revelations, go and visit him. They get a partial confession. He admits at least to spying for the Soviets in the post-war period. He's reluctant to say much about the wartime period. But he never faces prosecution. Actually, Japan doesn't have an anti-spy law, so he couldn't have been directly tried in that way, but often they can be creative in finding other things on which to prosecute someone. That didn't happen in his case. He was already a very ill man, and he died of high blood pressure in July 1954. Okay, so this guy was a very, very important spy for the Soviets, and yet he is hardly known at all, certainly compared with Richard Sorge. Now, in the case of Richard Sorge, there are lots of books about him. There are various films. part of it is that he's just such an interesting character. You can read one of the kind of books about him, or you can read the chapter-length version in my book, but in either case, he's undoubtedly interesting. He's a sort of Soviet James Bond. There's lots of girlfriends, motorbike crashes, alcoholic binges. So he's definitely an interesting character to read about. But I think that's only part of it. I think our focus on Richard Sorge is also us being a victim of Soviet propaganda. They've deliberately promoted the Sorge story because it's an appealing one, but also because it reflects well on the Soviet Union. He was devoted to his motherland, so his father was German, mother Russian. He was a devoted communist, and he was a martyr to the cause. By some accounts, before he was executed by the Japanese, his last words were devoting himself to the Red Army. So this makes him a more kind of attractive figure for Soviet and subsequently Russian propagandists. And they've really gone to town on this. You have from the 1960s commemorative stamps to Richard Sorge. The one on the left, which I have a copy of actually, is the Soviet one. The one on the right is the East German one, because they wanted to have a sort of German hero for East Germany. The monument on the bottom left is to Richard Sorge in Moscow. The one in the middle in Azerbaijan, where Sorge was born. And then also you have his grave in Tama Cemetery, where the Russian embassy goes to visit it twice a year in order to lay flowers on it. So very much they're drawing attention to a story which favors them. They don't want to talk about Izumi Ko, a guy who was tricked and manipulated into spying for them and then ultimately died in misery on his own. So that's a little bit of a taster of some of the contents of the book. I see it's approaching 6:40, which was my kind of target time. So there's lots more to talk about, but I'd be interested in hearing your questions.